Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second Millis 3A MBTA Advisory Committee. I'm Bob Weiss, and I'm the Economic Development Director and the Planning Director for the town of Millis. And as you can tell, we're absolutely live here, but everybody is coming in via Zoom or viewing this on Millis Community Media. So I was alone here until I was just joined by an intrepid member of our Finance Committee. But let me now hand things over to our Advisory Committee's Chair, Jody Garzon. Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to officially call this meeting to order. This is the December 14th meeting of the MBTA 3A Advisory Committee. I'm Jody Garzon, the chair. We do have a quorum tonight, and with us tonight, and we probably couldn't do this without him, is certainly Bob Weiss, and with us is also several members from MAPC who are going to walk us through the different issues and progress, such as it is, that we are making on trying to put together what we have been tasked with. So I do need to try to pull up the agenda here.
I can do that.
So
Somewhere.
I don't know if are there any announcements or updates from anyone in the group that we need to share before we plunge into our discussion, the meat of the meeting. All right, hearing none, I'm going to move on to, I assume, hand it off to MAPC for our continued discussion of multifamily rezoning proposed bylaw process.
Thank you so much. Bob, can you give me permission to share my screen, please?
Yes, I can. I'll stop sharing and let Mr. Cruz in there. Okay, go right ahead.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and get this show on the road here. Alrighty. Thank you all so much for taking your time to be with us this evening. We all really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in at home or who'll be watching this on a live recording on Millis TV sometime in the near future. This is the second meeting of the MBTA 3A Advisory Committee, and it is Wednesday, December 14th. Today we're going to be talking through just the welcome and opening. We're going to talk about the different focus area options that our team has gone through with our analysis for 3A options. We're going to talk about the public forum on visioning. We're going to address some of the questions that the committee had towards the end of the last meeting, and then we're going to open things up for discussion and questions moving forward. So the first thing I'd like to take some time to talk about this evening is these different 3A zoning focus maps that we put together. And I want to share with everybody our methodology for how we took the town as a whole and then started narrowing things down to see where it makes more sense to start having a conversation. Here we see the town, it's got a green outline, we can see the neighboring towns, and we have this red area that more or less encompasses the town center for Millis. This is where the mixed-use commercial district is. This is where some of the larger underutilized sites are, and it's going to be focused throughout, so we wanted to make sure that that's noted here, and that's the red circle with the dashes in it. The gray lines are all the different parcels in town, so we can see the different patterns of development, and that's also really helpful as we go through these types of analyses as well. When we go ahead and overlay something over the top of those parcels, we took a look at all the different zoning districts, and the different residential ones are varying shades of yellow. The industrial ones are gray, and the commercial ones are red, and this sort of coral color with a orange dashed outline is the mixed-use district right there in the town center. And we can already start to see how the area inside of this red circle is a little bit unique compared to what the rest of the town looks like. And as we've gone ahead and had these conversations, what we've been hearing from you all is that we don't really want to modify the character of the town. We want to be able to keep this beautiful rural New England charm that your town has, and we also want to be able to make sure that we're doing everything we can to comply with these regulations. So we want to take a look at this and look at it from a perspective of saying, okay, what if we don't mess with, don't modify anything that is part of a zoning district that only allows single-family homes? And those are the other two residential districts that were in the darker yellow colors, and we just made them dark blue and said we're going to exclude those for right now. We're not even going to go ahead and think about it too much. And then this gives us a little bit more of a focused area where we can start looking at options. And again, we see the industrial areas, the commercial areas, the mixed-use areas, and the residential district that already allows for some multifamily to be built. We take this into consideration, and then we start thinking a little bit about what the different regulations are from DHCD and how we're able to actually make all that stuff work. And since our last meeting, they provided all of the people that are working on 3A projects some different geographic information, computer files, GIS files that allow us to see where they're telling us land is not developable. And when we overlay that over the top, we did so in a slightly lighter blue color, and we can see there's a lot of overlap with the residential areas and with the excluded land from DHCD. So now we're looking at this in a different layer and saying, okay, we don't want to really modify the single-family residential districts. We want to start looking and seeing where there's other options, where DHCD says options are appropriate, and then where do all of these different sorts of viewpoints and policies kind of come together. And again, we're seeing that the town center looks like it could be a potentially good fit for accomplishing all of those different goals. We're still seeing some industrial sites to the east, to the west, and to the center, as well as some other commercial space that could be a possibility if we want to leave the residential districts alone as much as possible. So, looking at this, we started looking at some other pieces of information that have happened as a result of previous planning efforts in the town. And one of the places we went to was the 2019 housing production plan. And this plan identified 8 different sites. Some of them are pretty close. 1 and 8 are more or less the same, 4 and 5 are more or less the same, 2 and 3 are really close, and then 6 and 7 are a little bit more out into the wilderness a little bit. But we started looking at this, and we're seeing that there's some patterns, there's some clustering that's happening, and we want to make sure that everything that we're doing throughout this zoning effort is not something that we want to reinvent the wheel, or we want to start looking at things and discarding all the other planning efforts and time and effort that so many folks have put into making these things successful. So we started looking at the older plans. We started saying, what do these plans say? What are their recommendations, and how can we maybe make that work with some of the things that we have going on here? Most of these sites are pretty close to Main Street, and numbers 1 and 8 that you can see near the town center, they're adjacent. The GAF and the CLECO sites are the ones that are right here. So with all of this in mind, as we start trying to figure out what to do with old planning efforts, how do we make it work here? How do we take the expertise and research that's already done? We looked at all this and said, okay, here's some other options that we can take a look at, zoom in a little bit more and see sort of what this looks like. We put all of it together first. The red dots are the same dots that we saw on the previous page with the housing site options, and this has the addition of a couple yellow shapes towards the town center here. The one to the west is Exchange Street, the one to the east is the GAF and CLECO sites, and these are both areas that were coming out of the Urban Land Institute Technical Assistance Program that Millis went through, where they bring in a bunch of experts and go through a project and some visioning and talk about where they think it would make a lot of sense to do a lot of things. And these are the two areas in town that they kind of focused on and said, if there's going to be efforts made towards doing some sort of change, this is where it would make sense to focus it. And they talked about on the western polygon here, this little triangle shaped thing, they were talking about, that's Exchange Street, and they were talking about having some sort of streetscape improvements, some other placemaking activities, things of that nature. And then over on the right side, this site was identified as potential senior housing, multifamily housing, some other kind of greater density to be taking a look at there. So we got all these different things happening. We have the new stuff from DHCD. We have the old stuff from the Housing Production Plan, the old stuff from the ULI TAP program, and all of the other things that we want to consider when we go ahead and do this. So where does that leave us moving forward with this 3A discussion for tonight? The first place that we want to take a serious look at, and we're looking at these not as anything that is final or set in stone, we want this really to be a starting point for a conversation as we start thinking about, would this make sense to start a 3A district in these areas and then maybe expand it and see how far we can go? We have this first site, which is the GAF and CLECO site. It has a handful of uses in this building here, and the well is right kind of in the middle of this white building that wraps around, and that's also the big blue circle in the map in the lower right-hand corner. That's called a wellhead protection area, and that land is subtracted from the amount of developable land on a property. There's a handful of things that they'll go ahead and do that for, and that's one of them. So that's where we get this big circle happening right here. And what we have here is two parcels, one on either side of the train tracks, in addition to some of the mixed-use stuff that sits right on Main Street. We have 9 acres on the southern parcel and 11 acres on the northern parcel.
Excuse me, John? Someone has, if someone can mute, I hear some noise in the background, it's getting a little bit distracting, so if somebody can mute, thank you.
Because a question came in the chat, if you could just give a little bit of background on the housing production plan that the town did.
Yeah, the town has a housing production plan. I'll put it on the website, the webpage tomorrow. I can put that on there. It was done actually by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in 2019, and what it does is it speaks to a lot of the issues you're going to be hearing tonight. While the select board did adopt it, we don't really have much in the way of policies and goals, though the plan itself does state some policies and goals that the town has adopted.
There is a summary of some of those goals and policies in the background material summary that we included in your packet if you want to look into it further. But just because I've worked on many housing production plans throughout my 4 years at MAPC, I can tell you one of the parts of them is you're working with the community through this process where you gather a lot of public input, you do spatial analysis to say, where are areas where it makes sense to have housing based on, various different factors, walkability, access to transit, all different kinds of things that you take into account. And then you identify some sites that the state wants you to look at for where the town would encourage housing development there based on, utilizing different kinds of tools. So when we were looking at this, we wanted to capitalize on that long engagement process through that housing production plan. And John here's looking at some of the sites that were identified, but we're kind of considering them in terms of how they could speak to broader general areas that, help us as we're looking at where areas for 3A zoning would potentially make sense. So hopefully that's enough background for now, and
I have a question or two also that we've got a break here. First, Nicole just typed it. Thank you. Why is the DHCD land excluded, and what does that mean?
Yeah, John, you went over that, I think, at our first meeting. Could you give that background again, John? And then I guess we'll just get back to it.
Yeah, so this means that this is the land that is excluded from development calculations, and it's used to determine that 1.5% of developable land. And we did a little bit of reverse engineering on this, and we have a slide a little bit later on in the presentation that gets into this a little bit more in depth. So for now, it just means any land that if we include it in a 3A zoning district, the area of that amount is going to be subtracted from the amount that's developable. So that's all it means, and we'll get into that in a little bit.
And my other question is, and I don't mean to be flip here, but I don't want to lose all my commercial real estate in the middle of downtown for housing. And secondly, I want to comply with the law here to receive the grant funding and avoid the stick. But I don't want to really encourage this to be something where people come in and tear up my last two commercial districts to put in housing. I would rather look at some of the single-family residential areas with an open mind, especially things that could take 20, 30 years before they come available. But I just don't want to lose all my...
No, I certainly appreciate that, and I do want to respond to it too. It doesn't mean, if you had 3A zoning that you couldn't have commercial as well, but let's just get through the next couple slides, because then we're going to have a discussion about all of this and the potential areas. But this is just to give you information that we're going to consider in our discussion. But all of that we're going to get into in a moment.
All right, folks, getting right back at it here. We talked about the non-developable land with the wellhead, and as we can see, there's a lot of it throughout the town. We've had other discussions before about swampland and stuff that's owned by the Army Corps and things like that. This by itself, just the gray area, is 9 acres on the top, 11 on the bottom, and that is the developable, 9 on the bottom, 11 on the top, and that's the developable land, so that's subtracting the circumference of the wellhead protection area here. And this is just a basis for a place to start. So if we wanted to look at this as maybe a place to look at for a district, maybe not the entire thing, this is about 20 acres, give or take, that would get us close to halfway there just with this one site. And this is the different development sites, number 1 and number 8 from the HPP recommendations. If we go a little bit further down the road to the industrial area on the west side of town, this is another place that was identified in the HPP as a development site, 1400 Main Street. It's currently a lumber yard. It just has a bunch of trucks kind of moving product in and out of it. It's a very strangely shaped parcel, and in some ways it looks very similar to how a lot of multifamily developments are set up, with a relatively narrow entryway to the main road, and then a larger part of the parcel filling out behind there. And we can see there's some kind of interesting geography in these parcels around here. But this is another part of the discussion as to if it makes sense to keep this the way it is, if it makes sense to have it as a basis for a zoning district that would comply with 3A or be a substantial part of it. One of the things we do know from the reservation, the regulations around 3A is that in order for a site to count, it has to be at least 5 developable acres, and this is 7. So we could certainly do something over here, even if we were just looking at this single site. Mm-hmm. And this is where sites 4 and 5 on the housing production plan recommendations were just about right over here. So a little bit of food for thought. It's a little bit away from the town center as we're asking ourselves these questions about what do we value most between the industrial, the commercial, and the residential. This is the kinds of stuff that we need to be thinking about. If we are wanting to do something that takes a look and modifies some of these areas along Main Street, our team is saying these are the places where it seems to make the most sense to do so. Doesn't mean that it's the only places, and we'll get into all that in just a bit. So I want to go ahead and bring this back up just to kind of bring our heads back out of the zoomed in sort of framework a little bit, look at the town as a whole again. We have our red center dots, we have all the different development opportunities, we have everything else that's set up and showing us how it's all layered on top of each other. we take this and we say there's kind of three areas within these that we can take a look at. We have number one, which is this mixed use area right down the center of Main Street. And we kind of split that into two different focus areas. One of them is the Gaff Clico site on the north side of Main Street. The other one is a commercial development right across the street there on the south side of Main Street. So we're calling that 1A and 1B. And then site number 2 is the one that is over on the west side and somewhat focused on that single lumberyard parcel. So this is what we're seeing is a good starting point for conversation. Certainly not anything that's finite. And what we're going to do here is go ahead and bring this back up because I really want to have this conversation around what do we think all of this means and what do all of our how do all of our thought processes kind of line up here. So we got this one again, and I want to just at this point pause, and I'd like to hear some thoughts. Do we want to keep our focus on commercial? I want to hear about people that feel that maybe we need to do something a little bit different. So gut reactions, first sort of thoughts, reflections, where are our heads at here?
I think the 7 acres that you're calling Site 2 has more potential for me than losing the large commercial acreage downtown. Maybe part of that can be considered. But I was thinking along the lines of, I don't know, I just don't know enough about this yet, but Stony Brook exists. I mean, that was rezoned, it wouldn't be developed for years, potentially. It's our apartments. Again, the goal that I have is to try to comply, but not encourage, and not make it something that can happen immediately. So, something that's easy to develop, I think, is okay, but I'd rather have something that takes some time and requires the developer to acquire a larger time commitment to get it done.
And Craig, thanks for sharing that, and I totally appreciate your concerns about losing any kind of commercial potential there. But as we were looking at this analysis, the reason that we started to hone in on area 1 and thinking about opportunities north and south of that Main Street area is because that mixed use zone currently allows multifamily, but it has to be approved through special permit.
Right.
The RV residential area, which is that kind of light yellow beige area, also allows some smaller multifamily, but it has to be approved by special permit. So even some of the commercial areas, commercial zones, I should say, also allow different forms of residential. They have to be approved by special permit. 3A zoning by the state standards has to allow multifamily by right. So these zones don't comply with 3A, but they are the closest to complying. So that's why it seems like a starting point for conversation. They also, in relation to the rest of the town, allow the most variety of types of homes, where the single-family residential zones are mostly allowing just single-family residential, and they have very distinct character, and you usually run into a lot of pushback when you talk about introducing higher density multifamily in those areas. So that's why we use this as like a starting point for conversation. But you'll notice like the red commercial zone there along Main Street that you can see on that map. That's another area where some housing production plan opportunities were identified to have some potential there. We didn't really include that because we felt that there was a lot going on there already, but it is something that you could think about as well. But I just want to be very clear that many of these zones that are on this map right now do allow multifamily housing, but it just has a special permitting process. And if you have a zone that's going to allow multifamily, it doesn't mean that it's not going to allow commercial as well. And really, as a core guiding principle of planning, you want to have like a mix of uses. It's always good to have housing supporting commercial and commercial supporting, neighborhoods.
I think that's what I was just keying in on. I mean, like, I think we shouldn't look at this as losing commercial, but it could be looking at, like, how do you improve commercial zoning, and by bringing in more people into those areas, you're only going to benefit the businesses that are there because you have even more built-in potential customers.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Nicole?
I hate to keep bringing this up, but if I may, I'd like to go backwards a step. We're looking at areas, and I just personally feel that before we begin looking at areas, we should have established exactly how many zones, how many acres we need. And the bylaw, the law states that we need 50 acres or 1.5% of the buildable, developable land. And looking at this light blue, dark blue map, and if light blue is everything that is excluded, that to me seems like we have a lot of the town is excluded from our calculations. So it seems to me that we should be determining, one, what land is considered buildable, how many acres are considered buildable, are not excluded, and then determine what is 1.5% of the non-excluded land. And then we would have a better idea of how many acres are we talking about. We're looking at 9 acres here, 11 acres here, 7 acres here. Just from my 12 years on the zoning board and 30 years in real estate, I'm asking, are you creating an issue of spot zoning? That seems to me that you're going to have someone complain about spot zoning. And I don't know whether spot zoning it doesn't apply because this is a state regulated zone district that we have to create. But I just feel like before we start talking about where it goes, we need to know what are our requirements? How many zones, how many acres do we have as a minimum? I'm no mathematician, but I'm looking at this, and all of these light blue spots are excluded. There's not a whole. I don't think. Do we really have 50? Are we looking at 40 acres? Are we looking at 30 acres? So, I feel like that we've skipped that step.
Well, so these questions came up at our last meeting, and we have been coordinating with the state to try and get answers to them. That's going to be an ongoing process. As you know, this is all very much in the initial phases of rolling out at the state level. So, we kind of have to bear with the state where they are, but we have been looking into this, and we did reserve some time at this meeting to talk about what we have gathered so far. And maybe it would be worth it, John, to just go to slide 26 and let everyone know what we've learned from coordinating with the state.
Sure, absolutely. And so what happens is we got all of this GIS data from the state that tells us there's a couple different data sets. One of them is a sensitive land one, which isn't mapped here. Those are areas that they encourage us to stay away from, but they won't include them. And then the excluded land, which they say will absolutely under no circumstances count. And let me go ahead and jump ahead here. Okay, so this is where we're at on this. How was the developable land calculated? And so the unit capacity tool on the 3A website is where the final number from DHCD comes from. So if we go to that website, the 3A website, and they have that table of all the different municipalities that are MBTA communities, those are the final calculations, and that's what it is. So for each community, they've gone ahead and done the math. They've determined if it's 1.5% or 50 acres of developable land, and whichever one is less is what they went with. So we took this data set, and for every every parcel in all MBTA communities, there's different columns, there's different fields in this spreadsheet data set that goes along with this GIS. That is how many square feet of sensitive land are on a parcel and how many square feet of excluded land are on a parcel. So what we did was we took all the parcels in Millis, we added up the total number of square feet for all parcels in town, and then we looked at all the square feet of the developable acres after subtracting what was excluded. And when we multiplied that number by 1.5%, we got, give or take, 56 acres. So I think that's exactly what DHCD did. They haven't told us directly that's what happened, but since we're now using the same data sets that they have, we are going to be working with the assumption that Millis is assigned a 50-acre 3D district, because that's what it says. Once they confirm their calculations with us, we'll know 100%. But the idea is that even though there's all this other land that we can't work with, it's not excluding parcels, it's excluding land that's on a parcel. So if part of a parcel has a little bit, or 13 square feet that can't be developed, or 1,300 square feet that can't be developed, that just gets removed from the calculation. There's a lot of challenges with making that work here in Millis. However, right now it seems like that's the option that we have to move forward with. We're looking at 50 acres of developable land.
So it is, yeah, an ongoing process to really get through all the nitty-gritty details with the state, but from what we understand right now, it's going to be 50 acres as the requirement. And when we're looking at this in kind of in response to what you brought up in terms of spot zoning, you know, we do have some sites from the housing production plan that we wanted to show because it helps us think about areas around those sites that we would be thinking about in a visioning stage for where we would want to create a 3A zone. But we wouldn't be 3A zoning over one site or two sites. I'm sure the state wouldn't want to see spot zoning as much as we wouldn't want to see that. But right now, we're using a broad brush. We're looking at a general vision, a general area. And so we're trying to determine with you what general areas make sense to look at and to gather public input on. All of the other stuff, the details about how the zone is going to be written, how it's going to have its regulations, those are kind of the details that come after we first take a high-level look at where do we want to look at this, where is it going to make sense. And so maybe if we could go back to the map we were on, John, and then we have some of the other questions too that are in this section we'll come back to, but you know, so like when we have those circles there, we're not like talking about a specific site, we're talking about like generally these areas. And so the thing is, this mixed use zone in the kind of pink shaded color there, it is the zone that is already closest to complying with 3A. So it's, you know, if you were looking at that general area, you know, whatever a 3A zoning could look like there, if that was where we wanted to, you know, put it, it would be the least difference from what currently is there in terms of regulations. And so that's why we started there. And so, you know, in some ways, it's not as big of a lift as it seems. Like the mixed use zone that's there, and in some aspects, the RV residential zone that's around it are like pretty close. They're just going to need, you know, there's things about them that they don't comply with 3A because they don't allow multifamily by right, and there's different density and dimensional requirements that probably don't comply either. But when you're looking at the existing zones, those are the ones that are pretty close, and the mixed use zone is really not that far off.
I'm going to speak to something else about the spot zoning really quick too. And for most of the MBTA communities that are subject to this regulation, they have some kind of either rapid transit or commuter rail station. And for those communities, there's a requirement that the district be within a certain distance from that station. And in addition to that, for all of us, them who have the transit station and Millis who doesn't, the requirements for the sizing of the districts, it says it has to be 50 acres total. And if you want to split them into more than one district, one district can't be fewer than 5 acres, and one of them has to be at least 25 acres. So for a lot of communities, it would take a decent number of parcels to pull together to get 5 acres, and because Millis has a little bit more of a rural character, we're able to get 5 acres out of a single parcel in a great number of locations, right? So I think that we would want to include multiple parcels in any zoning district that we put together, but it still has to be within those frameworks. We couldn't do, for instance, 10 5-acre parcels. We would need to do, I think we could have at most 4 or 5 between the 25 and then the other ones that were 5 acres apiece. I know that was a lot of word vomit, but I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I mean, this is all information that we've brought to try and facilitate a conversation with you about, in a general sense, what are the areas where it makes sense to think about where we could look at 3A zoning in a broad sense, in a visioning sense, and where we would feel comfortable talking to the public about it.
Well, if I could, here, we mentioned a couple of documents that the background information cited, which we talked, which we got in our packets. We mentioned the master plan of 2000, the housing production plan 2019, and the Urban Land Institute's technical assistance plan of 2020. All three of those mention diversifying the housing stock, and they also mention the town center. And so it seems that we seem to have a pattern here. I also want to reiterate what we've talked about before, that if we're looking at the town's Center for Economic Opportunity Development, the MCEOD, what we're looking at, as Alex has mentioned, you know, it's not a heavy lift from where it is now to where we want to go. Adding a little more density in housing would not eliminate the potential for commercial development there. And in fact, if you consider the commercial development in the center of town, which is, really caters as much to development in town as it does, tries to bring folks in, business in from out of town, it really can enhance, there's an opportunity to enhance the commercial. At the same time, we're looking at densifying the center of town. But we would not be eliminating the MCEOD.
Well, it would enhance the commercial if you didn't take all 27 acres we're talking about, the 20 acres downtown, and turn it into residential. So, I mean, you're right, something can be done there, but I mean, if those are my large commercial areas to start with, and we have to find 50 acres total, we've identified 20 basically in areas 1A, 1B, if I'm correct in that number.
That isn't correct. The 20 acres would just be 1A.
Okay, so, and 1B, that's overlaying the Roach Brothers Shopping Center area, basically?
Yeah. So the 1A was just the 2 parcels on the north side. It's probably give or take 20-ish acres on the bottom half too.
Okay. So, but those are the 2, well, the Roach Brothers one is our commercial center, basically, or,
Right.
I mean, will become a food desert. You'll take away the grocery store if the developer who owns that decides to go with housing because it's more profitable than retail. I'm not saying it is or isn't. I know nothing about that thing. But if they decide to go that direction, so there's areas that I think do make sense to consider absolutely in the downtown area. I just want to be careful that we are also considering areas that may be a lot of smaller parcels that have to be put together, which slow things down. I don't. I think when those plans were written, Bob, we weren't contemplating 750 units of housing development.
This is true.
I think we were talking about how do we put in maybe 100, or 200, but not 750. So I think there is some merit to those. And I think that, as I said, I think that 2 pretty well works in my mind just on the first blush. 1A at some level works if it's restricted to enough to allow some commercial in there as well. I don't want to lose 1B necessarily, to this. But that's my thought on it, at least. I just want to be, because whatever we put through is going to have to pass town meeting. And I promise you, if you talk about developing 1A and what they did in Medway right along the road with that huge development, if people think that's going in at the GAF Lico site, this is never going to pass. So it has to be well crafted and well designed. I mean, the stick only goes so far. We can lose grants if we don't do this, but we have to put whatever we put in makes sense. So that's my thought, and I just want to be careful what we that we don't lose that commercial space that we so desperately need, and we don't build something that is just, or we don't give the indication that we're going to build something quickly that, or allow something to be built quickly, and that would look huge.
Yeah.
Madam Chair?
Go ahead, Nicole.
What's the?
Just to your point, Craig, on parcel 2, just playing devil's advocate, just to give everyone some information. When we had Tractor Supply go in, which is just a little bit east of, it's within that industrial area, but it's east of that green circle. Tractor Supply actually does have some random residential homes on either side. And we had a lot of complaints from those couple of residents with regards to the industrial use, which really is commercial, but what was going on in that location, and how it affects those few residents, and how having industrial use and residents together don't always mix. So I would just be a little cautious in saying we can put in any sort of residence, in this case multifamily, in what is already an industrial area, because we have industrial businesses there that are there by right under their zoning, and that have the ability, they don't have the same requirements as in, our different single-family resident areas, because they are industrial, they're loud, that can be loud property. And are we going to, if you put in a residency there where you're going to have people that are complaining about the pre-existing business noise all the time, are we going to, in effect, drive out some of the businesses that we have? So not saying yet, not voicing an opinion one way or the other, it's just something that I think we should, just one thing we should consider when looking at an industrial area for potential residents.
And Nicole, my thought would be that those industrial places would probably have to be acquired to build the residential. So, again, I'm not looking at this as being able to cohabitate well with industrial. You're absolutely right. We'd have to be a swap of the district would have to switch over as developer acquired parcels.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Madeline?
Yes, I think these points that are being raised are absolutely true based on a lot of the projects that have already gone on in town and the feedback that we've gotten. So I would say, yes, we have to be kind of cautious, because again, it's going to be a very delicate balance in how you handle this. So there's a lot of things to think about here, and I think back to the original point is what is developable that will meet these needs and meet the compliance. But you're looking at a lot of light blue areas there. It's going to be very tricky, and mixing residential with some of the more industrial areas along that route might be difficult. So I think this is going to be something that's going to take another 2 or 3 hard looks.
Yeah, I mean, that's really useful information, and that's kind of what we're hoping to learn more about is, should Area 2, which is just there for conversation, be in consideration, or should we just be focusing on Area 1 and talking about north of Main Street near the town center and south of Main Street near the town center? I mean, I would really like to know how the whole group feels about Area 2 as opposed to Area 1. And it sounds like a few of you have some concerns about Area 2.
I would
Madam
say,
Chair, may I say something?
sure, go ahead.
I think this is a really good initial start, and I think, even though it is the very beginning of it, I think they've done a pretty good job isolating the areas where, in my opinion, make good sense. I think it was a good start. I've been a real estate broker in Millis for over 40 years, and I understand Ray's concern about commercial, but Millis has never been really a place that a lot of commercial business wanted to flock to. And part of that was because we were 10 miles from 128, 10 miles from 495. That said, I think one of the smaller developments that went in, Centennial Place, was pleasant to look at, and I think is something that model in the future could be something that we might want to look at. And when Centennial Place was done in the beginning, it was set up so that you had commercial on the first floor, you had office space on the second floor, and you had residential on the third. It made the residences on the third floor difficult to finance because the residential portion of that mixed use was only 33% of the total building, so it was hard to get financing. If that was redone and you had commercial on the first floor, that would give us some place to put additional commercial business, and if you had residential on the second and third floor, it would give you the ability to have more residential units there. And I know there's a lot more work to be done, but I think initially, for me anyway, I'll only speak personally, I think they've done a great job in initially identifying the sites that make a good starting point and deserve a further look. Thank you.
Now, one
Yeah,
of the
and
things,
I like that mixed use.
yeah, Craig? Craig?
Okay.
Thanks. So one of the things that I also like with 1A and 1B is trying to keep the higher density residential closer to where services are, because as things get spread out, that means you have more cars on the road, more trips, more pollution, more wear and tear on the roads, whereas, you know, one of the best things about the Stony Brook developments are that they're convenient to a lot of services. There's a lot of things that, you know, aren't the best about those developments, but the convenience is great, and by putting some by right development potential over in that area, you know, no apartment buildings stay around forever. You know, they have the potential to be redeveloped, at least some of it. And there's other land that also has the potential to be developed in that area as well. So I like the idea of the 1B section, not, you know, to see the commercial part developed into residential, but to allow greater residential development in that area.
Madam Chairman?
Yeah, Craig, go ahead.
And that's what I was talking about Stony Brook. I mean, if rezoning that over to this was one of my thoughts, it wouldn't mean immediate development, but it's already a high density area. We can increase the density back in there, should the developer or a developer decide to do that. I would stay away from the mixed, as I said, I'd stay away from some of the stuff that's already commercial, but I like that idea of that area. Some of 1B makes a lot of sense.
And I do have a question, you know, if we have sites that have potential contamination issues, can they be included in these calculations, or do they become excluded?
Yeah, and I saw that question come through the chat just a minute ago. I saw it just a minute ago. I know it came through about a half hour ago. I don't think there's a whole lot in the regulations that speak to things like brownfield sites and brownfield cleanups or anything like that. And so whatever, and they go into it in great depth on the website, what they all take into account. But whatever it is that they're taking into account for the excluded land, if they didn't feel like there was anything that they could verify was a contaminant that said, you know what, that we need to take this land out, then it isn't really a concern for our purposes. And it could be, of course, a concern for a developer who might have to do, you know, anything from soil remediation to advanced testing or whatever that might be. However, for our zoning purposes, DHCD is looking at this and saying, yeah, we think that if we haven't excluded it, that it should be developable.
Okay. And where we have mixed use zoning, how could that play into by right, you know, denser residential zoning? Would that mixed use allowance have to kind of be superseded by the denser residential zoning, by the 3A zoning? Or how would those two play together if we're looking at that kind of row shaded area?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all questions that we'll have to figure out throughout the process and kind of down the road. You know, that's something where we have to determine, do we want to change that zone to be 3A compliant? Do we want to do a portion of that zone with a 3A overlay that has different regulations? All of that is, you know, something that would take a lot of time. The nuts and bolts of it would come on later. DHCD just released this compliance model like the day before Thanksgiving. We've been looking through it, but essentially any kind of zone that we come away with, which is again way down the road, we have to run it through the compliance model and see if it actually does comply. And so it's going to have to meet that minimum density requirement. It's going to have to meet the size thresholds. There may be dimensional requirements and other things in it that we can set, but we need to make sure then that doesn't detract from the minimum density, and so it still complies. So again, like all that stuff is complex, and we can figure that out. But just to start, we have to think about where do we want to look, you know? So to answer your question, it's a question we'll have to answer along the way.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Nicole.
Is that, can we I know, generally speaking, that one parcel of property can be subject to multiple overlays. So can, Alex, can you and John, for our next meeting or whenever the state comes out is able to answer this, can we find out if 3A is, if they will allow a 3A overlay to coexist, for lack of a better, with other overlays? Because I think our mixed use area is an overlay district. All of those lands have an underlining zone, and then the mixed use is an overlay. So if we could also, if we determine that is still land that we want, you know, we want to keep that as commercial or commercial access or mixed use, could we do the 3A overlay so that some of those parcels have multiple, have the 3A and the mixed use? Because just realistically, just because we put a multifamily overlay doesn't mean that's what a developer is going to choose. You know, if the land is right on and it is facing 109, for example, it may be beneficial for them to do mixed use over 3A, but would still be qualifying under that amount, you know, getting in our 50 acres. So is that something that like I said, I assume that the state, you know, hasn't probably answered that question yet, but when it does, if you guys could
I haven't
to your list of questions that we have.
Yeah, I don't think we need to, I don't think we need to bring it up with them. I think that it's one of those things where, especially for the communities that have a transit district or a transit station and a district around it, a lot of these communities have transit-oriented development districts that already exist. And they're going to have to overlay things with multiple zoning districts to comply with the, unless they want to completely transform their other overlay district that exists. So I haven't seen anything in the regulations that says we can't do that. I see no problem moving forward with it. Alex, is there anything that you've seen that could speak to this?
I mean, yeah, I assume that there's a way forward. I just don't want to say for sure because, you know, this is like an ongoing conversation with the state. But we will add it to our list so that we are sure of it at some point. And then when we get to the point of the process where we have to make that kind of a decision, we know what our options are. So I think this has been a really good start to the conversation. I want to just try and get a little bit of a consensus to some extent, if we can, about Area 2 versus Area 1. And think about Area 1 like with just as one. Is Area 2 an area that we even want to be considering, or should we limit our consideration to Area 1?
I would consider it.
Yeah,
I consider it as well. Yeah.
because I'm concerned with getting to the adequate amount of acreage with the developable sites that we have, so I wouldn't want to exclude something at this point if we're not sure that we can get above that hurdle.
Yeah, no, I think we should include it at this point.
Okay. We didn't mark out the commercial area there in red, where there were opportunities identified in the housing production plan. But just while we're here, does anyone have any thoughts on that area?
I think it's worth taking a look at.
But yeah, the housing production plan though, was that 2000, did you say, Bob, right around there?
Yeah,
2019.
That
The-
predates all of the construction that's gone in there now, so I mean, that was,
the master plan, right.
there was other stuff there that doesn't exist anymore, so it becomes an attractive parcel. But it's worth a consideration if we zone it, if we can do it right, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, if we're looking at Area 2, I mean, that's the industrial district. Again, I think we go back to Nicole's question of can we overlay an industrial district with high-density residential?
I mean, yeah, you can, but all of the concerns I've raised about industrial uses and residential uses clashing are valid, and so I think we would just have to think about the best way to do that to minimize any kind of, you know, uses that aren't compatible. At projects at MAPC, I have seen zoning districts designed in a way where some lighter multifamily and lighter industrial uses can be in harmony, but you know, you could overlay the zone, I know that.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Nicole?
just so everyone knows, this red area, to the left of the green number 1, this red commercial, that actually, most of that was added last year into our mixed-use development. We did extend the mixed use to that area. It's
Yeah.
not marked here in rose, but that, we did pass that last year.
Okay, so
I believe that the mixed use ends, ends at Hammond Lane, doesn't it, Nicole?
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
So I think,
And
the-
so I'm thinking, so that, where you have the arrow right there, Bob,
Yeah.
that's Pleasant Street, correct?
that would be Pleasantry, right, and just to your left, yeah,
And,
yeah.
yeah, so.
And that's
this-
Hammond Lane.
It extends right down to almost the end of that red,
Correct.
that area is now, considered mixed use.
That's good to know.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and now where we have the residents in the middle, the mixed use overlay did not apply there, because that was, RV, but it did, so
Right.
there is that little gap, from the police station to basically just before Pleasant Street, but everything that is marked commercial, we, did overlay the mixed use,
Okay.
last fall, I think, I wanna say it was fall of 21.
Okay, we will certainly take a look at that and get all that stuff figured out. We want to make sure all of this is as accurate as it can be.
Yeah.
So it seems pretty clear that the group would like at this visioning stage to be considering 1A, 1B2, and maybe we need to just think about that area as well, and maybe it's like 1C. Another point of consensus that I just want to confirm is it seems like having a mixture of commercial and residential use is pretty important to this committee, and when we're looking at 3A, that's something that we want to accomplish is to have a mix of residential and commercial. Would that be fair to say as well?
Yes, I would say so.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would say that.
Good.
Okay. All right, that's good. Well, I think this is a good start to the conversation, so I want to see if we can move forward to talk about how we carry the conversation forward with the public and what kind of input that we want to gather from the public. So if you want to advance the slide, John, I'll start getting into that. So at this meeting, I want to give you a little bit of sense of why we want to gather public input through this visioning process, why it's important and why it's useful and why it will improve the process, and to give you some of my initial thoughts on how to have that conversation. Next month, we plan to have another committee meeting with you where we'll actually go in depth and review the materials that we're going to prepare to present at a forum focusing on this topic, and exactly how that meeting would run and how we would promote it. So there is another meeting that's going to solely focus on this, but to get the conversation kicked off, I just want to go through some of my thoughts first and see what you think. So first, we really need to make sure the public understands what this 3A MBTA law is, that it is a requirement from the state, why it's important for Millis to explore complying with 3A. We want to understand from community members and stakeholders in Millis about what general areas it would make sense to have a greater variety of housing, to have multifamily housing. We want to understand what the community's concerns are so that we can take that into consideration through our process and address those concerns. And we have to remember that although this is a requirement, it can still be an opportunity for the community to receive benefits. As has been pointed out throughout our conversations, more density in commercial areas can really support local businesses. It could attract new businesses. There are other benefits, and so we want to think about what benefits does the community want to see, and how can we make this process work for them. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that I think I'd like to understand as we get ready to prepare some materials for a forum is, would we want to gather input similar to how we did tonight on these 3 areas, or let's say 4 areas, or do we want to first have an area kind of determine where we want to just gather input on that area? It seems to me like from the conversation we want to keep these multiple areas in play, and maybe this question's already been answered, but in terms of asking the public about general areas, like, is there something different we should do here? Does the public need to see all the parcels and the different colors, or do we kind of need to, you know, make it a little bit more everyday person? Thoughts on that?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Madeline?
Yes, because I do work for Millis Community Media, and we put this information and other important things like this out to the public, just from the feedback and reactions we've gotten to similar things we've done in the past for projects coming into town or new build opportunities coming into town. I would suggest maybe letting all areas be under consideration by the public.
Madam Chair, I would agree with Matt.
Yeah, I tend to agree as well, because, I mean, we certainly don't want to give the appearance of steering at this point. Let's talk about, you know, if we're talking about, you know, these many areas, let's have that be part of the conversation with the public at this point, versus narrowing it and then opening it up, and then folks feel like they've been blindsided because we didn't talk about that, you know, from the beginning.
And I think what we can do is absolutely allow people to have input and say, you know, maybe we've gotten all of this wrong, and if there's other places we should be looking at to do some additional multifamily by right, let us know. And maybe we have something that's like a big map on a foam core board where people can put in push pins and tell us kind of what they want and see if it lines up with what we have going on here. What we want to do is take a look at the areas that have the greatest amount of housing types that are already allowed, and ask people, are you happy with this, or would you rather see something different happen here? And if you want to see something different, what would that look like? And if we start seeing conversations where people are like, this really needs to stay the way that it is, then we can leave that alone. And if we see other people saying, you know, something really different needs to happen here, we should be considering it, that's what we want to do. And that's where we have to have a little bit more focused discussion to be able to make sure that we're getting feedback that's a little bit more easy to translate into a start of a zoning district. But I think at the end of the day, we absolutely do want to be able to have people tell us, look, if you guys are doing this, this is where I think it should go, and allow them to have the opportunity to say in their own words what exactly it is that it should look like, and what are the things that they've seen in other communities that they don't like, that we can make sure we are trying to avoid as much as possible with this project.
Okay, so it sounds like we're in agreement that we should give multiple options, and by the head nods, I'm seeing that we should also, you know, allow the public to make suggestions for options that aren't here as well. All of that input we want to collect. We want this to be a public-driven process, and ultimately the decisions that are made, you know, should come from there. So let's go to the next slide. The other thing that I think is valuable to ask the public about is what kinds of housing types do they like, or they think would make sense in these areas that we would be visioning possibly having a 3A zone. This is a diagram that has like the full range of lowest density at single family A to the highest range of density at high-rise multifamily letter P. So John, if you go to the next slide, when we're thinking about 3A in a multifamily zone and the requirements we have to meet by the state in terms of density and so forth, you know, we wouldn't have those lower density housing units in that zone. It wouldn't really make sense in you know, a mixed-use commercial walkable area anyway. And so much of the town has these single-family homes and different lower density homes. So let's not think about that. But if we go to the next slide, let's also not think about the really high density housing types either that just aren't going to be appropriate for a small town like Millis. But in terms of gathering public input, I think it would be good to know, you know, from these different types of homes and this zone that would allow some different types of homes, what types of homes does the public like? What do they think would be appropriate in these areas? And so we could look at that this way in terms of what types of homes do you like? Do you like townhouses? These are diagrams. We could also include some photo examples of what some of these look like. We could also have an activity that's a little bit more of design, like is there certain design features that you would like to see in any kind of multifamily that would go in one of these zones. So I wanted to see what your thoughts are on collecting this kind of input, and if there's any other kind of input related to this that you think that we should be collecting.
Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead, John.
I think giving the public a choice of 13 different types of housing, I don't think you're going to get something that one will be accurate, because I think they'll most likely be guesses, visualizing what they might want to see or not see next to them. And I think this is also something that we may want to get some input from people that have developed parcels like this, that, as to what makes the most sense first, and then based on that, then bring it to the public and say, for reasons of achieving this density, that this is the type of housing that makes the most sense. Because if you look at these different diagrams, I don't know what the benefits from what they say at that moment would be. I don't know how beneficial it would be. Thank you.
Well, are there others on this diagram, and you have your background, and others on the committee that have some of that expertise? Are there other housing units here that we just know aren't going to make sense, and so we, want to narrow it down a little bit more to give the public options that are actually going to make sense based on our expertise?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Rick?
So I was just thinking about this. Currently, we have 3 possible 40B projects on 109, and all 3 are different. So I would agree with Jeff if we come up with something that we want to see in Millis and only give the people a few choices. I look at mixed use is going to be appealing to people. We have proposed multifamily over parking also. I don't know if a conversion works in Millis, but I just think as a committee we should probably try to think of how we want all these projects to kind of look somewhat the same. Like you said, we have 3 that are upcoming, and all 3 are completely different. That's my thought.
And to speak to that, there's certainly other things we can do on the regulatory side as far as having some kind of architectural design standards and things like that, so we can get some of that cohesive town feel and make sure everything stays the same. And Jeffrey, we would think about a lot of the same things you were. That's been what's been going through our heads as we've been working with Bob to get a focus group set up of developers who are either from Millis or done work in Millis or thought about doing work in Millis, and get a lot of their thoughts as far as what happened with some of the projects, why did things fail or not fail, what do they like to build, what do they see as appropriate for here, and we will certainly have that by the time that we take all this to the public.
Madam Chair?
Hold on, Owen. Yeah, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so I guess 2 questions. With this zoning though, ultimately it's up to the developers, the potential developer, as far as like what kind of housing type that they would opt to build based on their pro forma, I'm assuming. So to me it feels like if you give people these options and ask them what they want to see, all that could, in theory, go out the window, because the developer's like, well, that's not economically feasible for me, so I'm not going to do that. My other thought is that, I think a lot of people probably when they hear this idea of like multifamily zoning, they immediately go to the mid-rise and the high-rise and think like, oh, we're going to have these like giant monstrosities in our town. And so I almost wonder if like painting a picture of educating like, what are all these other types of housing types that could fulfill this, and not necessarily give a choice, but just maybe kind of like try to open people's ideas to like, it's not a high rise. There are other options that are going to fit, and it could be these, and showing examples and doing things like that might be the more beneficial thing for people.
Yeah, oh, and I mean, I think that was kind of the intent, but we can do it a little bit differently, and just get more at the fact that it doesn't have to be a big multifamily building, that we allow, but as you also say, it does have to be something that's going to work for a developer, make financial sense, and something that's going to have be able to comply in terms of being able to meet our density requirements. So, you know, we can take another look at this, but this conversation is helpful to start out, you know, understanding that you've been, you know, like mixed use would be one of the ones we'd obviously want to be looking at, that you have proposed multifamily over parking before, conversion you're not sure about, but it might be a possibility. And then as John notes, and we'll talk a little bit more about later, is we are getting a focus group together with some members of the boards that review development as well as developers that build housing, which will give us a better sense of what would make sense, so that what we do ultimately bring to the public is something that we know is viable. So we're not, you know, giving them any false options, but certainly want to also be able to get their feedback and to let them know that it doesn't have to be some really big building.
Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
To Owen's point, I like actually Alex's idea of saying, okay, maybe showing these high rises, saying this is not what we're talking about. But to Owen's point, I would like us to be very careful about what we present. 12 years ago, we received a grant, I believe from MAPC, on how to rezone the GAF property. And we spent a lot of time and a lot of money and well, MAPC spent a lot of money through this grant. And they came up with a couple of really interesting ideas after having public input and having the public pick out what they wanted, what they preferred, and having sports complexes and all these things. And because we were doing that, there was the perception in the public that I have people ask me still to this day, when are we getting that sports complex over at GAF? I remember going to a meeting and we voted and that's what we wanted. And having to explain to people, those are ideas of what we could zone, but it's private property. And though we can set regulations, we can't dictate what somebody wants to build on their property. And there was a lot of backlash a year or two after those meetings because people thought that we were getting a sports complex and we were getting, a brewery, restaurant brewery type of thing. And there's still people that ask me about that. That was my first year, 12 years ago on the planning board. And people still, they were all great concepts, but the gentleman that owned that property had no interest in doing any of that. So I would rather focus on saying, okay, this is not what we're gonna get. If you're worried about we're gonna end up with a 8-story high-rise multifamily, that's not what we're looking at, but not saying, what do you want to see? Because we can't, if it falls within the parameters, we can't say to a builder, okay, you have to do you have to do townhouses, but you can't do cottage. We could say you can't have a parking structure, but we can't say you have to have a courtyard. So I want to just be careful about how we present these pictures.
Yeah.
I thought Owen first.
Well, I was gonna say, I think, and Alex, maybe you could clarify on this, but I think part of like what you said is that as part of this, we could instill some like design guidelines. So then certain things like, I know obviously that would include like things like setbacks from the streets, but I think you could even you could potentially take that further as far as like courtyards, parking structures, no parking structures and all that, I believe we could kind of like set those frameworks up that the developer then has to like come in and, abide by.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Craig.
I was gonna say, I think what Nicole pointed out is, because I was at that meeting, and they wanted to bring a YMCA in. I worked for the YMCA, I said, that's great, who's got 12 million at the time, now 850. But still, how are we gonna do that? And I think that the absolute point is explain, it's not gonna be a mid-rise, it's not gonna be a high-rise. We as a committee, and I'll just hypothetically prefer the mixed use as something we'd like to consider. But it can't be a single family, it can't be a two family, it won't be a mid-rise, it won't be a high-rise. Beyond that, it's going to be something like whatever fits, and we can, even if we decide, we vote and we discuss further, if we really wanted to push the mixed use, I believe that would be in our purview to, and Nicole's my zoning expert, I do on this. But if we were to push that like we did with the Centennial Place development, as an option, I think that's a strong idea. I think that addresses my concern and many other people's concern, and I think it would give a built-in base for the commercial, if it, small commercial. I'm not talking big box stores or anything like that. Something other than pizza.
Madam Chair,
Go ahead.
there is a way that we get a consensus in the real estate developments that I've worked in on what people like. We look at Burns Consulting, we look at Zond, we look at there's a lot of information now on what people like and what they don't like. And if you look at past, development, you can get an idea. Those that sold out, those that didn't sell out, what people liked about the design, didn't like about the design. So I'm not objecting to asking people, trying to get them what they want, but a lot of the residents aren't going to know. So if we do some research ourselves and we can point to plans, size, successful developments, I think then, paring that down, having that information ourselves, and then presenting to the public what those comments are, what those consultants and those successful projects tell us is that it is something that most of them will probably like. So we can do some of our own research and look at, some of the new construction that's gone on and how well they sold and how quickly, because that's an indication of how well the public accepted them.
Yeah. Madam Chair?
Yes, Bob.
Yeah, when I did a couple of presentations, and we did one to the planning board and one to the select board early on, one of the things I used was some photographs of an MHP. I don't know if, John and Alex, you've seen the MHP had some photographs of some 15 unit per acre developments. Some were mixed use, some were just in neighbors, but they had photographs of the finished product. Maybe one of them was an architectural rendering. When I look at something like the diagrams here, it's kind of like looking at it out of context. So, but I'd be glad to send around those photographs and send them to you guys, send them to the committee as well, because it shows these things in reality, what they look like. So I'll be glad to share those with the committee.
That would be great if you could share that, and, this is definitely good food for thought for us, so that we're prepared, to bring you something that kind of takes this into account, at our next meeting, where we can really go through it again. And before then, we also, Jeffrey, will have had a focus group with developers, so we will have, some input from developers on what would work and what is typically successful. And, based on what everyone's saying, John and I can definitely work up some different ways to get across this point that we think is important to make about the different variety of housing types that we could have, but that also gives realistic options, and we can facilitate that and get that feedback back a little differently. Just seeing that we're actually close to time, I'm going to move forward for now. The other thing that I think would be beneficial to ask the public about is what other kind of benefits they'd like to see come through this process. And you've been talking about it a little bit tonight, but having more housing in a commercial area can benefit that area by supporting businesses. I mean, if you know that people are footsteps away, you can be pretty confident that you can locate your business there. A lot of times, rental units are more accessible to people who work, so it can support the workforce. It can create places to gather, be more of a destination. So I think we could pose some of these potential benefits that could come from the process out there and see maybe through some kind of polling what the public would really be interested in, and that way we can kind of tailor our efforts in such a way that 3A zoning could help bring about some of these other things as well. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's the whole reason to do this. Is what, I mean, that's what we started with, to make housing more affordable for teachers and others who can't afford to live in the community they serve because there's nothing available. It's like, this is critical to put out there. I think this is the reason that we're supposed to be doing this. It's the reason we should support it. But yeah, and if we can do that in a way that doesn't impact the commercial, then that's perfect. Or enhances the commercial. That's perfect.
Okay, great. Well, we'll work these up into closer to finished products that we would be presenting at the public at our next meeting. But John, if we go to the next slide, just to give you a sense of what we're looking at is, to keep up with this timeline that we have, which is dictated by when we need to comply and so forth. And this is our big visioning phase. We need to have a forum in February, and so we have time at our next meeting to really talk about exactly how we're going to have this conversation. But it'll be an in-person event, as we've heard from you, that would be the best way to engage the public on this. So we'll have somewhat of a presentation, and then we'll have different engagement activities where you saw a little bit of our thoughts on those just now, but we'll prepare actually the materials that we would plan to use to review together in detail at our next committee meeting, which we want to schedule around this time next month. And once we do have a time and location confirmed, then we would work up a press release and some other promotional materials. And one of the really big things that you could do as a committee member is to help us get folks in the room and to make sure that all voices in Millis are being heard. People who don't typically get involved in these processes, we want to hear from them. We want to hear from as many voices as possible. So you can expect some communication on that once we do have something confirmed. I mean, February is a while away, but we just want to be diligent in our planning. And we will, again, review all of this in January to make sure that what we do take to the public at this forum is something that we all feel comfortable with and we've put a lot of thought into. But any thoughts on any of this, any questions that you want to go over now?
One thing I can offer is that Millis Community Media would be very happy to help with the getting the word out, press releases and things like that. We can talk about that offline maybe another time of what you might need.
Sure, yeah, we can certainly coordinate with you, Madeline. All right, well, with that, I'm going to give it back to John. I mean, we're almost at time, but we did start looking into a lot of these questions that have been raised through the process, and John's gathered some information about them. We already talked about the developable area one, so maybe if you just want to go to the minimum lot size.
Yep. So there was a question asked last time if the minimum lot size could be applied to a 3A zoning district. We haven't gotten our answers back from DHCD just yet, but we went ahead and took a look at all the regulations and all the different tools that we've been given that we didn't have at the last meeting. And there's nothing in the DHCD regulations that limits lot sizes, setbacks, landscape buffers, parking, any of this kind of stuff. So they're being very respectful of whatever the local character is of the town to be able to say, you know what, this is what works for us, so this is what we want to do. And this was, I believe the question was, could we have a minimum lot size of at least 5 acres and force people to consolidate if they wanted to build in an area that had some smaller parcels? And it doesn't seem like there's going to be any concerns for minimum lot sizes for 3A projects built by right. And I think we're going to be okay to move forward with that as we think about what our processes look like moving forward. So, just in the back of your heads as we're thinking about all this.
Just a word of caution though, like when the zoning is drafted, it's got to go through the compliance model and it's got to meet the different density requirements. And so if any of these things like setbacks end up affecting the density, then we might have to rethink it a little bit. But the point is that we can set, setbacks, landscaping, design regulations and so forth, just as long as it's going to meet the minimum density requirements. But again, that's all like details that we get to at the end of the road.
We also had some comments and questions around non-compliance penalties, and the question was raised about what penalties would be applied to communities that don't adopt the 3A zoning. We know that the Housing Choice Initiatives, the Local Capital Projects Fund, and the Mass Works Infrastructure Program are all, quote, listed funding sources on the 3A guidelines. So what it actually says is that communities will not be eligible for the listed funding sources. That it defines the listing funding sources as these 3 things, and then it gives this little sort of vague plus other things that we haven't determined yet. So they're reserving the right to change the policy, or it's likely going to be used in things like when they're scoring grant applications for all kinds of stuff. So one of the things we have learned since the last time that we had this meeting is that housing authorities in Massachusetts are partially funded by the Capital Projects Fund, and it is anticipated that communities that do not adopt the 3A district or don't comply with these regulations will see a reduction in their housing authority budgets, likely around 10%, and we would have the housing authority, we were going to be reaching out to them and asking them about how much of their budget is actually funded by the Local Capital Projects Fund. We do know a lot of housing authorities have been getting letters from the state saying if your community doesn't adopt this district, your budget will drop and this is what it's going to look like. So again, we don't know what all the penalties are. They haven't all been confirmed with us, but this is one of the bigger ones that has been coming up on a lot of people's radar recently as a very near immediate effect of what not adopting a 3A zone would look like. And that's everything on my end. We had those few that were answered. We know that there were a few more that people had that we haven't figured out just yet, and we're looking forward to getting those answers and having a continued conversation with everyone. But that does it for our presentation. I do apologize that we're a little bit over time. Before we turn it over to you guys completely, I want to let you know that our next steps on our end are going to be the upcoming focus groups with the town staff and developers. We're going to be looking at development trends in Millis, so a lot of the stuff was alluded to today in this meeting around seeing what developments happened and what didn't and how they did and all this other kinds of stuff. And that's all going to be in addition to planning for our first townwide engagement that we've been discussing throughout the meeting this evening. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things back over to the chair. And whatever kinds of continued discussion we want to have going forward, I'm looking forward to hearing it.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions or comments before we move on from this point?
You guys have been so great at speaking up throughout the whole meeting. Really kept the flow of things moving. It's been great.
And helpful. I feel like I understand a little better of the task in front of us, and the questions are coming into sharper focus, which is always good because you kind of start from a questioning of everything, and now some of those questions have been answered, which is helpful, and then opened up other questions. So I certainly feel more confident that I kind of know the task in front of us. So one of the the things, do we want to set our next meeting date while we have everyone here? It's always a challenge.
Okay.
If it's helpful, maybe we could talk about a general time in January, and then we could send out a poll, and everybody could just mark the times that they're free, and then we could look at that and find a time that works for everyone. Would you like us to do that?
That's fine.
Yeah. Are there any days of the week that are poor for anybody? I know, Jody, you mentioned that the Finance Committee, well, they're gonna start up in what, actually February, right?
Yeah, February, so
Okay.
January will be pretty open.
Right, and Nicole, you've got it was a Tuesday night for the planning board.
That's
Just
January 10th.
January
Right
10th.
now, we only meet once a month.
Okay, and
Yeah, we've got
Craig, you got the 4th?
January 4th, 16th, 23rd. No, I take that back. 4th and 23rd, we've got for sure.
Okay. And those are Monday nights?
The 4th is a Wednesday night,
Oh, that's right, Wednesday.
because our chair decided we're not meeting on January 2nd.
That's probably good.
She's a sweetheart like that, isn't she?
I think MAPC will need like more or less of about a month to produce the materials for the forum to review together. So we can put out some options the week of the 12th and the week of the 19th, and then that way we won't be hitting the 10th, the 4th, or the 23rd.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good. I would petition for the week of the 12th more than the week of the 19th or the 16th.
Yeah, and the Wednesday the 15th is open, but we'll see what comes back. You don't have select income yet, so.
Okay, so then how
Right,
about,
you and I are looking at different calendars, because to me, January 15th
I'm in February, I'm sorry,
is a
February.
Sunday.
I hit February, I'm gonna have the 18th and 25th, both are wide open.
Thank you for saying something. I'm over here thinking, man, it's been a long day.
I was-
my calculator.
It was just, I already got to February, looking at select board meeting after select board meeting.
Okay, so we're talking about January, a week or two, a month or so from today. So
Right.
The first week is the week of the second is the 9th, and then the 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th.
okay.
Yeah.
So we'll put the options in a poll, we'll email them out, make sure it works for everybody, and then we'll confirm from there.
Okay,
Thank you, Alex.
sounds great. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, see ya.
All right, thanks everyone.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. We adjourn.
Well, I will take a motion to approve the minutes from someone on the committee.
I make a motion that we approve the minutes of, I'm looking for the date here real quick, as written.
15th, wasn't it?
Thank you, yeah, of the 15th.
Yeah.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of November 15th.
No, I'm sorry, it's November 15th, right, sorry.
November 15th as written. Any further discussion? No? All those in favor, please indicate aye.
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 Any opposed or abstaining? All right, thank you. Thank you, Bob, for helping us get that done.
All right.
Any further announcements or anything that we need to discuss before we adjourn? All right, hearing none, I will take a motion to adjourn.
Madam Chair, I make a motion we adjourn.
All right, I'll consider it moved and seconded to adjourn. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
All right.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Great, thank you, everybody.
Good job.